this is gonna be a small rant at the moment, nothing special. It's basically because of our current situation of the virus, economic inequality on a extreme scale. We haven't seen since the golden age. Economic inequality, economic disasters, environmental disasters, and people in power becoming more powerful and richer than ever, and using new ways of technology to, instead of liberating the people, it's used them to oppress them more. And we need to abolish all hierarchies. And this is what we need. We need to abolish whole hierarchies. We need to live in a non-hierarchical, decentralized, horizontal structures like we humans have lived for 95% of human history. And in fact, for our current material conditions, we are re repurpose it, that we already re-meet the material precondition to go back to the ultra egalitarian the immediate return societies like we see in hunter gatherers like the San people, the Hadza people, the Sandawe people, the African pygmies, Aboriginal Australians, the Amasi people, also known as the Berber people, etc. We actually can go back to these types of society without going to hunter gatherer, but still keeping cities and stuff like that, urbanization stuff. Same thing to the philosophy of Murai Bookchin of dialectical naturalism. Although I will warn you, I should reject all forms of dialectical philosophy, especially when it deals with metaphysics and understanding of the external world outside of the philosophy of history, and to a lesser extent political philosophy. Do not put it into practice of other forms of knowledge. But besides the point, we can actually go back. But the only problem is our society today, although people would disagree, like very specific centers, but it's on foundation of the most extreme authoritarian hierarchical elements. The most popular one is the fascist philosophy of kratocracy, or might is right. That we need power to establish things. You can see that every country in the world, because they have a centralized hierarchical state, from the United States to Scandinavia to Japan, and even the so-called socialist country where reality they're capitalist country like China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. They, there are only few places in the world where they are truly libertarian, like Rojava and Chiapas, Mexico, and the geographic location of Somia. So we had to put this into practice globally because everywhere function under the fascist philosophy of might is right. And even then, postmodernism as a philosophy has suffered this as well, especially when they deal with the philosophy of science. Especially you take the most extreme end of the anti-realist approach to science, which is epistemological anarchism from Paul Faberton in his book Against Method. In his own admission, any form of science is legitimate, including in his own admission anti-Semitism and all the forms of racist science, because postmodern approach to science has suffered the same conclusion as the fascist philosophy of might is right. Is at the even then, like, if we have to go beyond that because other countries are very pro conquest, not just imperialism and colonialism, but conquest for the sake of conquest, for one more territory. Like we see how Israel treated the Palestinians, how the United States treat the people of Puerto Rico, how Japan treats Okinawans or Luchuans, which is their indigenous name. Because people of Okinawa are not Japanese, unlike what the Japanese community trying to convince you. The same thing how Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria try to oppress the people of Kurdistan, or Sri Lanka trying to oppress people of Tamil Lima, or the United Kingdom trying to oppress Irish people, especially in Northern Ireland, which belongs to the rest of Ireland. We have to stop this at all costs. We need to do a revolution on a political, social, philosophical as well. We have to do it at all costs because the famous phrase of Rosa Luxemburg of socialism or barbarism, in this case, is either anarchist communism or human extinction as we speak. And we need to stop this at all costs because if we don't, the inequality will keep evaporate, exasperate, although history doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme. It does have a pattern. So if the first Gilded Age lasted for around 30 years, so in this case, it may end in a possible 30 years as well, give or take if we use previous examples as reference points. So somewhere in the 2040s, 2050s, give or take, it should, the second Gilded Age as we know it should possibly end. The problem is, will it lead to another form of popularity of fascism and Nazism like we see in the United States? Or we can see a renewal of anarchist type thinking like we see in India with the protest of the farmers, which is the largest protest in human history. 300 million people, or 3.5% of the India's population, which by the way, if the U.S. population is 300 million, so imagine if the entire population of the United States in a protest, that's something. And remember, the George Floyd protest is the fourth largest protest in human history when it comes to how many people participate. You know, and more popular arguments recently, especially among the fascists, is the population boom. Like, while reality, the Earth can handle a population up to the trillions, and we're not even close to that. Where does it come from? Originally, the concept of social Darwinism as we know it was originally created as a response to early anarchism. One great example is from a quote of Peter Marshall. He said, firstly, we should point out that all doomsday prophets and population boom have been proven wrong time and time again. The direct predictions of Thomas Motsu, the originator of the population myth, had not come true, yet neo-Malthusians continued to mouth his reactionary ideas. In fact, wrote his famous Essays on the Principle of Population, which inflicted his laws of population onto the world as a response to the anarchist William Godwin and other social reformers. In other words, it was explicitly conceived as an attempt to prove that social stratification and so the status quo was the law of nature, and that poverty was a fault of the poor themselves, not the fault of the unjust and authoritarian social economic systems as such. The theory, quote unquote, was created with a political goal in mind as a weapon in the class struggle. As a side, it should be noted that Darwin argued his theory of natural selection was the doctrine of Motsu applied to the whole animal and vegetable kingdom. In other words, anarchism indirectly inspired the theory of evolution. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in the form of social Darwinism, which also used working against working class people and the social reform. Another example of fascist political policies put in practice was at Ronald Reagan, where he put the doctrine of equality, gave the official seal of approval to ideas of racial superiority that fascists had used for years to rationalize the exploitation of minorities. If on average blacks and Hispanic are only about half as much as whites, if more than a third of all blacks and a quarter of all Hispanics live below the poverty line, if the economic gap between whites and non-whites was growing, well, that just proved that there was a racial component in the social Darwinian selection process, showing that minorities deserved their poverty and lower social status because they were less fit by focusing on individual, laissez-faire economic hides the social roots of inequality and the effect of economic institutions and social attitudes have on inequality. One example by a liberal economist, not a socialist at all, James Cabrit, had wrote, and I quote, what the economists did, in effect, was to reason backwards from the troublesome effect to a cause that would rationalize and justify it. It is the work of the efficient market, they argue, and the fundamental legitimacy of the outcome, if not supposed to be questioned. The apologia is a dreadful thing. It has distorted our understanding, twisted our perspective, and grappled our politics on the right. As one might expect, the winners of the expanded scale of wealth and income are given a reason for self-satisfaction and an excuse for glory. Their gains are due to personal merit, the application of high intelligence, and smiles of fortune. Those on the losing side are guilty of sloth, self-indulgence, and whining. perhaps they have bad culture, or perhaps they have bad genes. While no serious economist will make the last leap into racist fantasy, the underlying structure of the economist's argument has undoubtedly helped legitimize before a larger public those who promote such ideas. And again, a quote by Rick Way, another economist: the logical correlation of this social Darwinianism is that whites who are less fit, aka poor, also deserve their poverty. But philosophy and racial hatred are not necessarily consistent, thus the ranks of white supremacy organizations have been swollen in recent years by undercreated and underdeveloped white youth frustrated by declining industrial labor market and an undesirable eroding of the social status. Rather than drawing the logical social Darwinian conclusion that they are true or inferior, they instead blame blacks, Hispanic, Asian, Jews for unfairly taking their jobs. Thus, the neo-Nazi skinheads, which we see today, have been mostly recruited from disgruntled working class below the age of 30. All sources find that people who are joining neo-Nazi groups are very young people. And that's provide leaders of extreme right-wing groups growing in all over the world, from India with Hindu nationalism, with the United States with pro-Trump or Christian identity, or in Europe where they're trying to revive fascist ideas, in Germany sadly reviving some fascist idea, Japan conservative and pro-nationalist movement, they're trying to place the emperors, etc. And this is the problem. This is one of the cases where fascism is becoming popular because the economic system which they themselves promote because when they don't benefit the poor whites, they will blame everybody except the economic social system. And they will have to subscribe to racist ideas, which you can see has been promoted in all forms of media. Even stereotypes, something as harmful as like a certain racial group eating a certain food can benefit the racial ideas of one group to another. One of the more popular examples is video games, where has been promoted right-wing reactionary ideas for decades now, and portraying other groups of people who isn't a Western European or American as a good guy, and anybody who is not white, especially Western European, North American, is a bad guy, especially the Slavic people, Latinos, the Africans from Sub-Saharan Africa, and sometimes East Asian, mainly Chinese, occasionally Japanese if it's a World War II game. I think that's all I had to say for now. What I can tell you is the world doesn't work like that. The universe functions actually under the anarcho-communist principle of mutual aid and cooperation. You can see that in nature, especially if you're a biologist or zoologist. You can notice that. Every scientist will tell you in the publications of evolution of cooperation and evolution of mutual aid. It's nothing like the social Darwinists and fascists and Nazis ideas, which is inherently based on the principles of anti-socialism and Christianity. And their biggest influence to come to those conclusions are Christianity themselves, especially for the Nazis. They got their biggest influence from Martin Luther, how he viewed the Jews, and their biggest influence for Hitler was the United States, how they treated the Native Americans and the African Americans, and the Latinos, specifically Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans. So yeah, thank you everybody who watched this video. I will see you guys next time.